She was dressed in her finest gown and handed a bouquet of winter roses, and not one person in that house told her she was walking into ruin. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps beneath wool and settles into bone, and Alara Ashwood stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom with trembling hands and a heart full of misplaced hope, believing, truly believing, that her stepmother had finally done something kind. Before we go any further into Alara's story, I want to pause and ask, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because this community spans the entire world, and I love knowing who is here with us. And if this kind of storytelling moves you, please like this video, share it with someone who loves a good historical romance, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. Now, let us return to Alara, standing at the edge of the greatest deception of her life. She was 22 years old, the only daughter of the late Lord Henry Ashwood of Wiltshire, a man of modest title, but generous heart, who had died 3 winters past and left behind a daughter, an estate, and a second wife who had never loved either one. Lady Cecilia Ashwood, née Hartwell, was a woman of striking appearance and bottomless ambition, and from the moment her husband drew his final breath, she had been quietly dismantling everything he had built and everything he had loved. Alara had survived by keeping her head down, her expectations low, and her grief private. She tended the rose garden her mother had planted before she died. She read in the library her father had filled. She stayed out of Cecilia's way and hoped, in the quiet and desperate manner of the powerless, that things might somehow improve. They did not improve. They worsened. And on a grey Tuesday in November, Cecilia summoned Alara to the drawing room with the air of someone delivering a gift. "I have arranged a marriage for you," Cecilia said, not looking up from the letter she was sealing. "A merchant of some standing. The ceremony will be this Friday." Alara had stood very still. "This Friday? That is 4 days from now." 3, actually. I miscounted. Cecilia finally looked up, and her smile was the kind that never reached your eyes. "You should be grateful. You are not getting younger, Alara, and your prospects are not what they once were. This man has expressed great interest." She had asked his name. Cecilia had told her Edmund. She had asked to meet him beforehand. Cecilia had refused, citing propriety and the man's busy schedule. She had asked where he lived, what his business was, what family he came from. Cecilia had answered each question with a vague pleasantry and a swift subject change. And by the end of the conversation, Alara knew almost nothing. And yet she had agreed. Because what choice did she have? The estate was Cecilia's to control until Alara married. The small inheritance her father had left her was locked behind legal language she did not fully understand. She was, in every practical sense, dependent on a woman who wished her gone. So she had agreed. She had allowed herself, in weak and human moments, to imagine that the merchant might be kind, that he might have warm eyes, that her life might finally begin. The ceremony took place in a small chapel 3 miles from the estate, attended only by a solicitor, a witness whose face Alara did not recognize, and Cecilia herself, who stood to the side with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. The chapel smelled of tallow candles and damp stone. Outside, the wind moved through bare branches with a sound like whispered warnings. Alara stood at the altar and waited. He came in from a side door, and her first impression was shadow. A tall shape, broad in the shoulders, moving with an uneven gait that she quickly understood was supported by a crutch tucked beneath his left arm. He wore dark, worn clothing that hung loosely on his frame, the fabric clean, but clearly mended in several places. His boots were scuffed. His coat was old. A strip of linen was wound about his right hand as though covering a healing wound, and his dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that was not styled but merely long. He was not a merchant. She knew that immediately, in the way that the body understands things before the mind can form the words. He was not a merchant, and whatever Cecilia had told her had been a lie, and she was standing at an altar in a freezing chapel about to marry a stranger who leaned on a crutch and wore a coat that had been patched at the elbow twice. She turned to look at Cecilia. Cecilia was studying the floor. Alara turned back to the man, Edmund, and found, with a start, that he was already looking at her. His eyes, when she finally saw them clearly in the candlelight, were not what she expected. They were steady and dark and deeply tired, the eyes of someone who had seen considerable suffering and had arrived at a kind of hard-won quiet on the other side of it. He did not look away when she met his gaze. He did not look ashamed. He looked, impossibly, like he was sorry. The ceremony was brief. The words were spoken. The ring, plain silver, slightly too large for her finger, was placed on her hand. And when the solicitor declared them wed and Cecilia exhaled a soft breath that might have been relief, Ilara Ashwood stood in the wreckage of her carefully maintained hope and understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, that she had been deceived. What she did not understand, what she could not have known, was that the man beside her, this silent stranger with the crutch and the tired eyes and the worn coat, was not a beggar at all. He was Edmund Cavendish. And Edmund Cavendish was the Duke of Ashenmore. The cottage was small enough that Ilara could stand in the center of it and almost touch both walls, and it smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something faintly floral that she could not immediately identify. And in the gray light of her first morning as a married woman, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the low ceiling and tried very hard not to weep. She had not wept the night before. She had refused to give Cecilia the satisfaction, and she had refused to give herself the release, because weeping felt too much like surrender, and she was not ready to surrender. Not yet. She had arrived at the cottage by hired cart just past midnight, Edmund walking ahead of her through the dark with a lantern held low, his crutch making soft impressions in the frosted mud. He had pushed open the door, stood aside to let her enter first, and then moved to the small hearth without a word and coaxed the cold ashes back to life with practiced efficiency. She had watched him from the doorway and said nothing. He had lit the fire. He had set the lantern on the table. He had turned to look at her with those same steady, tired eyes and said, in a voice that was low and careful and surprisingly refined for a man in a patch coat, "You may have the bedroom. I will sleep here by the fire." She had wanted to say many things. She had wanted to demand explanations, to ask who he truly was, to know what arrangement he had made with her stepmother, and what either of them stood to gain from this farce of a marriage. Instead, exhaustion had closed over her like dark water, and she had taken the bedroom, and she had lain on the narrow bed fully clothed, and she had stared at the ceiling until sleep took her against her will. Now it was morning, and the fire was still burning, and when she emerged from the bedroom wrapped in her traveling cloak, Edmund was not there. The cottage held only the evidence of him: a folded blanket near the hearth, a tin cup washed and set to dry, the lantern trimmed and put away. On the table there was a plate covered with a cloth, and beneath the cloth she found bread, butter, and a small pot of honey, still warm enough that it had clearly been prepared recently. Beside the plate was a cup of tea, cooling but not cold. He had made her breakfast before leaving. She stood and looked at it for a long moment, and something complicated moved through her chest that she immediately and firmly suppressed. She ate. She was hungry, and there was no virtue in refusing bread to spite a man who was not present to notice her refusal. Edmund returned 2 hours later, his boots muddy and his cheeks reddened by cold air, carrying a bundle of firewood under one arm with the crutch shifted beneath the other in a practiced arrangement that suggested long familiarity with the adjustment. He stopped when he saw her seated at the table with her hands folded and her expression composed in the particular way that meant she had been preparing what she intended to say. He set down the firewood. He waited. "I would like," Ilara said carefully, "an explanation." "Of which part?" he asked, and his voice carried no defensiveness, only a genuine inquiry, as though there were several reasonable options, and he wished to be precise. "All of it," she said. "Who you are. What arrangement you made with Lady Cecilia. What is expected of me in this situation." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Without the crutch he moved heavily, favoring his left side, and when he settled into the chair, he exhaled in a way that was not dramatic, but simply honest. The exhale of a man whose body caused him daily effort. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly, and she noticed again that he had the manner of someone accustomed to being looked at rather than someone accustomed to hiding. "My name is Edmund," he said. "I will tell you the rest in time, when I am able to." For now I can tell you this. The arrangement I made with Lady Cecilia was not made to harm you. And nothing is expected of you here. You are free to move about as you wish. You are free to write letters, to receive visitors, to make whatever demands of this household are within my means to provide. Ilara studied him. That is not an explanation. That is a collection of reassurances. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. You are correct, he said. It is. Then give me the explanation. Not yet, he said, and his voice was gentle but immovable. The voice of a man who had made a decision and was not to be shifted from it by pressure alone. But I give you my word that you will have it. And in my experience, that is not nothing. She held his gaze for a long moment, measuring the weight of it, looking for the slipperiness she expected to find and failing to locate it. His eyes did not slide away. He did not fidget. He did not perform contrition or charm in the exaggerated manner of someone who wished to manipulate. He simply looked at her and waited, and there was something in that patient, unflinching steadiness that was more disarming than any smooth word could have been. She looked away first. She hated that she looked away first. You speak very well, she said, aiming for observation rather than accusation, for a merchant. A pause. Do I? Your vocabulary, your diction, the way you hold yourself when you are not deliberately trying to appear otherwise. She met his eyes again. You are performing something, Edmund. I cannot yet determine what. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, You are very perceptive. I have had an excellent education in noticing what people wish to conceal, she replied. I grew up with Cecilia. Something shifted in his expression at that, not pity, which he would have resented, but something closer to recognition. As though he understood from personal experience what it cost a person to live years inside someone else's careful deception. He rose from the table slowly, reclaiming the crutch. I am going to make soup for supper, he said. You are welcome to sit in here or return to the bedroom, as you prefer. There are books on the shelf beside the window, if you wish for them. She looked at the shelf. There were perhaps 20 volumes, well worn, their spines cracked from repeated reading. She could not read the titles from where she sat, but the sight of them did something small and involuntary to her posture, a slight easing she could not entirely prevent. What kind of books? She asked. History, he said. Philosophy. 2 novels. 1 volume of poetry that I find useful on difficult evenings. She rose and crossed the shelf and ran her finger along the spines. History of England. Marcus Aurelius. A volume of Keats. She pulled the Keats free and turned it over in her hands. And when she looked up, Edmund had his back to her and was moving toward the small kitchen alcove with a quiet, competent efficiency that she was beginning to understand was simply how he occupied space, without waste, without performance, without noise. She sat in the chair by the window with the Keats in her lap and watched snow begin to fall outside, and she thought that her stepmother had intended this to destroy her. She was not yet destroyed. But she was deeply, profoundly confused. It was the hands that first betrayed him. Ilara noticed on the 4th morning, when Edmund set a bowl of porridge before her, and his sleeve shifted back slightly at the wrist, revealing the edge of a scar that ran in a clean, deliberate line from his palm toward his forearm. Not the rough, ragged scarring of a man who had worked with tools or survived an accident, but the precise, thin mark of a surgical blade. The kind of wound that was stitched closed by a skilled physician. The kind of physician that common men could not afford. She said nothing. She had learned, in 4 days of living in close proximity to Edmund, that direct questions produced careful deflections, whereas patient observation produced something far more useful. The truth, arriving quietly on its own schedule. She began to pay closer attention. His hands, she noted, were strong but uncalloused in the places that labor would have marked them. There were old scars, several scattered, but the skin between them was smooth in a way that spoke not of idleness, but of a life where physical toil had never been the primary demand. He held a spoon and his pen and his cup with an ease and precision that was entirely natural and entirely inconsistent with the worn coat and the cracked boots and the unassuming way he referred to himself as simply Edmund, as though he had no surname worth mentioning. His speech continued to confound her. He spoke in the measured cadences of someone privately educated, someone who had read widely and thought carefully and debated ideas with people of equivalent intelligence. When she had tested him, slipping a reference to Thucydides into a conversation about winter strategy to see whether he would catch it, he had not merely caught it, he had extended it, adding a counterpoint from Plutarch with the relaxed fluency of a man who found such references unremarkable. He had then stopped, quite visibly, and redirected the conversation to the subject of whether the snow was beginning to lighten. He was careful. But even careful men grew comfortable in time. On the 5th day, a boy from the village came to the door with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He was perhaps 12 years old, with muddy boots and an earnest expression. And when Edmund opened the door, the boy immediately swept off his cap and held it to his chest with both hands in a gesture that was entirely too formal for a child delivering a parcel to a cottage. "From Mr. Hargrove at the post, sir," the boy said. And there was something in the way he said sir, not the casual courtesy that anyone might extend, but a particular weight, a particular straightening of the spine, that Alara recognized as deference of a specific and practiced kind. Edmund took the parcel. He thanked the boy. He pressed a coin into his hand, and Alara caught the gleam of it in the pale winter light, the size and color of something considerably more valuable than a penny, and the boy's eyes went wide for just a moment before his face rearranged itself into practiced neutrality, and he replaced his cap and walked back down the path with the careful dignity of someone who had been instructed on how to behave and was trying very hard to do so. Edmund closed the door. He set the parcel on the table without opening it and turned to find Alara watching him from the chair by the window with the book she had not been reading open in her lap. "That was a sovereign," she said. "It was a fair amount for his trouble," Edmund replied, and moved toward the kitchen. "It was a sovereign," she repeated, "for delivering a parcel a quarter-mile in the snow. Edmund, who are you?" He paused with his back to her. The line of his shoulders was very straight. "I am the man you married," he said, and continued into the kitchen. She stared at the doorway he had passed through and thought, that is precisely the problem. The parcel sat on the table all morning. Alara did not touch it, but she looked at it, and what she could see through a small tear in the brown paper, the edge of a wax seal, dark red and clearly embossed. She turned over in her mind with growing unease. The following day brought something impossible to explain away. She had gone out in the mid-morning to walk the path behind the cottage, needing air and movement, and the specific relief of being temporarily out of doors and away from the charged, quiet atmosphere of shared small rooms. The snow had firmed overnight and the path was manageable, and she walked for perhaps 20 minutes before turning back, and when the cottage came into view she stopped. There were 2 horses tied at the gate, fine horses, glossy-coated and well-fed, wearing tack that was polished and clearly expensive. And beside them stood a man in a dark overcoat with a traveling bag at his feet, a man whose clothing spoke of London, of wealth, of a kind of tailoring that required multiple fittings, and came with a considerable bill. He was speaking to Edmund, who stood in the cottage doorway. And as Alara watched, unable to hear their words at this distance, the man in the London coat reached some conclusion in the conversation and did something that stopped her breath entirely. He bowed. Not a nod, not a slight inclination of the head between equals. A genuine, formal bow, the kind that acknowledged rank, delivered to a man in a mended coat leaning on a crutch in the doorway of a 2-room cottage. Edmund accepted it without visible discomfort, as though it were perfectly ordinary. He responded with a few words. He handed the man something, a sealed letter, drawn from his coat pocket. The man tucked it carefully inside his own coat as though it were precious, bowed again, and turned to his horses. Alara stepped off the path and behind the bare hedge of winter shrubs without entirely deciding to do so, and she waited there in the cold until the sound of hooves had faded entirely before she emerged and continued toward the cottage at a measured pace, her face composed, her mind moving very quickly. Edmund was inside by the time she entered, the door to the kitchen ajar, the smell of warming bread drifting through. Nothing about his posture indicated anything unusual had occurred. He did not offer information. He did not look guilty. He looked, as he always did, entirely and deliberately calm. She removed her cloak and hung it on the hook and sat at the table. And she thought about the sovereign, and the boy's swept cap, and the wax seal on the parcel, and the London man's bow. She assembled them carefully, the way one assembled the scattered pieces of a letter that had been deliberately torn, and what the pieces suggested, when held together, was so far outside the boundaries of what her stepmother had led her to believe that she could not quite allow herself to arrive at it directly. Instead, she said, that evening, as Edmund sat across from her with a book of his own, and the fire burned between them with comfortable warmth, "Do you know this area well? Wiltshire and the surrounding country?" He looked up. "Reasonably," he said. "And are you known here?" she asked carefully. "By the people in the village. By the families in the surrounding estates." His eyes moved over her face in that quiet, measuring way he had. "Why do you ask?" "Because," she said with great precision, "people have been treating you in a manner that does not correspond to your apparent circumstances. And I find I am no longer content to attribute it to local eccentricity." The firelight moved across his face. He was quiet for a long moment, a longer moment than his usual pauses, which were considered but brief. This was something else. This was a man deciding, with visible care, how much of a door to open and how far. "You are not wrong," he said at last. "Then tell me," she said. "Not yet," he said, and his voice carried the same gentle, immovable quality as always. But something in his eyes had changed. Something that looked, in the shifting firelight, almost like resolve, as though not yet had begun, quietly, to shorten its distance from soon. She held his gaze a moment longer than was strictly comfortable for either of them, then dropped her eyes to her book. Her heart was beating with a purposefulness she did not quite trust. Something was coming. She could feel it the way one feels weather, not yet visible, but pressing already against the edges of the sky. The storm arrived without apology on a Thursday evening, rolling in from the north with a kind of deliberate, total authority that made argument seem foolish. And by Friday morning the path to the village had disappeared entirely beneath 18 inches of snow, and the sky was the color of pewter hammered flat and showed no intention of changing. They were confined, completely and inescapably confined, in a cottage with 2 rooms and 1 hearth and walls thin enough that Alara could hear Edmund's breathing on the other side of the bedroom door on the nights when her own sleep was restless. 3 days, the clouds promised. Perhaps 4. The firewood was sufficient. The larder was adequately stocked. There was, in every practical sense, nothing to worry about. Alara worried nonetheless. Not about survival, about proximity. About what happened to careful distances when the space available for maintaining them was reduced to the width of a cottage and the length of a long, snowbound afternoon. The first day passed in relative order. They maintained their established rhythms. Edmund tending the fire and preparing meals with his quiet competence. Alara reading or sitting at the small writing desk composing letters she had not yet determined how to send. They spoke in the polite, measured exchanges of people who are aware that the other person is listening even in silence. They were careful with each other. It was exhausting. It was the evening of the second day that the careful structure began to give way. Alara had been attempting to read by firelight when the words began to slide past her eyes without landing, and she had set the book aside and drawn her knees up in the armchair in a way that was not particularly dignified but was entirely comfortable. And she had been staring into the fire for some minutes when Edmund, seated on the other side of the hearth with a document he had been studying, said quietly and without preamble, "You miss your father." She looked up. He was not looking at her. His eyes were still on the document, but the words had clearly been addressed to her. "What makes you say so?" she asked. "You look at the fire the way people look at things they associate with loss," he said simply. "And you have mentioned him twice in passing, always in the past tense, always with a particular care in your voice, the care people use when a wound is not yet fully healed and they are trying not to press on it." She regarded him for a moment. "You are very observant." "I have had considerable time for observation," he said, "and little else this past year." It was the most he had offered of himself without prompting, and she understood instinctively that the storm had done something to the walls between them, worn them slightly, the way water wears stone, not breaking but thinning. She did not press. She answered instead, which felt like an offering of equal measure. He was a good man, she said. Genuinely good, in the way that is rarer than people acknowledge. He was not remarkable or ambitious or particularly powerful. But he was kind, and he was honest, and he loved me as though I were the finest thing he had ever managed. Which perhaps I was. He was not a man of great achievements. She paused. I find I prefer that, now, to the alternative. Edmund had set the document down. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open, careful, something that was close to recognition. How long has he been gone? He asked. 3 years, she said. Long enough that the sharp grief has softened. Not long enough that I have stopped reaching, sometimes, for the fact of him, expecting him to still be somewhere in the world. She looked back at the fire. Cecilia moved very quickly once he was gone. I think she had been waiting. Silence settled between them, but it was a different quality of silence than they had managed before, less guarded, more inhabited. I know something of waiting people, Edmund said then, so quietly that she might have missed it beneath the sound of the fire. He was looking at the document again, but his eyes were not moving across it. She waited. She had learned by now that with Edmund, waiting was the most productive thing she could do. My father died when I was 19, he said. He was not a kind man. He was a capable man, effective, commanding, respected, but not kind. And yet when he was gone, I found I missed him with a ferocity that surprised me, because I had not thought I loved him, and I discovered I had been wrong. What I had taken for indifference was apparently something considerably more complicated. He turned the document over, a gesture that seemed more habitual than purposeful. Grief has a way of clarifying things one would rather leave obscured. Yes, she said softly. It does. The fire snapped and settled. Outside, the wind moved the snow against the window in long brushing sweeps, and the cottage felt, in this moment, extraordinarily removed from every other thing in the world. Edmund, she said, not as a prelude to a demand, simply as a way of beginning. Your leg. Your injury. Is it permanent? He was quiet for a moment. Not offended, she could see that, but assembling the answer from components that required some care to arrange. The leg is permanent, he said. A battlefield injury, not from the front, exactly, but near enough. I was caught in the aftermath of something that was not my battle to fight and suffered the consequences of being present. He shifted his left leg slightly, the way she had noticed him shift it when it had been still too long. The physicians were divided on whether I would walk at all. The crutch was presented to me as a concession, not an expectation. I chose to consider it a beginning rather than a conclusion. She looked at him, really looked at him, with the firelight finding the planes of his face and the gray at his temples that she had not initially noticed because it was subtle, threaded through dark hair, the kind of gray that came not from age but from prolonged and serious suffering. You were in considerable pain, she said. For a long time. I was, he said. No elaboration. No performance of stoicism. Simply confirmation. And during that time, she said carefully, there was no one, no family, no. She stopped, aware she was approaching territory she had not been invited into. There was someone, he said, and something in his voice shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but which she caught, because she had been listening to him with increasing precision for 9 days. Someone I believed would remain, who did not. He paused. I was mistaken about her character, which I prefer to attribute to the distorting effects of the fever I was running at the time, rather than to any fundamental deficiency in my own judgment. You were betrayed, Ilara said quietly. He looked at her then, and the openness in his expression was so unguarded, so briefly and completely undefended, that she felt the breath catch in her chest. I was, he said. Yes. She did not offer platitudes. She did not say she was sorry in the reflexive, hollow way that people offered condolence as a mechanism for moving past discomfort. She simply held his gaze and let the acknowledgement exist between them without dressing it in anything unnecessary. I think, she said at last, that people who have been genuinely betrayed develop a particular quality, a kind of stillness. as though they have decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that if movement was what led to the wound, then stillness might prevent the next one. She tilted her head slightly. I recognize it because I have been developing it myself. Since my father died and Cecilia began her management of me. Edmund looked at her for a long, still moment, and what moved through his expression in that moment was something layered and considerable. Recognition, certainly, but beneath it something warmer and more dangerous than recognition. Something that had not been there, or had not been visible, 8 days ago. You are not what I expected, he said softly. What did you expect? She asked. He seemed to consider this honestly. Someone easier to remain detached from, he said. The fire burned low between them. The storm pressed against the walls of the cottage with cold, impartial persistence. And Alara Ashwood sat in the armchair with her knees drawn up and her book forgotten and felt, for the first time since the night of the ceremony, something other than confusion and anger moving through her chest. It was something considerably more inconvenient than either. And she suspected, from the way Edmund had returned his eyes carefully to the document he was not reading, that she was not alone in it. Cecilia Ashwood arrived on a Tuesday morning without warning, which was entirely characteristic of her, because surprise was a tool she wielded with the same deliberate precision that other people reserved for more honest instruments. Alara heard the carriage first, the particular crunch of well-maintained wheels on the refrozen path that the village boy had cleared 2 days after the storm, and when she moved to the window and saw the familiar dark lacquered door with its brass fittings, something cold and separate from the winter air moved through her. She had known this visit would come. Cecilia was not a woman who released her arrangements into the world without following them to their conclusions. She would want to see, with her own eyes, the damage she had done. She had come to inspect the wreckage. Alara straightened her spine, smoothed her hands along the front of her dress. The good blue wool she had worn twice already this week because her wardrobe here was limited, and turned from the window to find Edmund already standing, the crutch positioned, his dark eyes moving to hers with a question in them. My stepmother, Alara said. Her voice was entirely level. She was quite proud of it. Edmund's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in his eyes sharpened and settled simultaneously, the look of a man who had been anticipating a particular development and was now organizing himself to meet it. I see, he said. She has come to assess me, Alara said. She will expect to find me diminished, frightened. She will want evidence that her plan has achieved its intended result. She paused. I would appreciate it if you followed my lead. He considered her for a moment with an expression that contained, she thought, a small quantity of carefully suppressed approval. As you wish, he said. Cecilia entered the cottage with the air of a woman doing something magnanimous by acknowledging the existence of a space so far beneath her usual standards. She wore deep plum traveling clothes that were new since Alara had last seen her, and her dark hair was arranged with the immaculate precision she always maintained, and her eyes moved around the cottage's interior with a swift, cataloging sharpness that she briefly disguised as casual interest. She looked at the low ceiling, the simple furniture, the books on the shelf by the window, the 2 cups on the table from the morning's tea. Then she looked at Alara. Whatever she saw, it was not what she had come expecting, and the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth betrayed her before she composed herself into pleasantry. My dear, she said, and crossed the room to take Alara's hands in both of hers in a gesture of warmth, so practiced it was almost indistinguishable from the genuine article. Almost. You look, well, considering. Considering what? Alara asked pleasantly. A brief pause. The adjustment, Cecilia said smoothly. Marriage is always an adjustment, is it not? She turned then, as though noticing Edmund for the first time, which they both understood was entirely false. She had been aware of him from the moment she entered. Her eyes moved over him with a calculation she did not bother fully concealing. The crutch, the coat, the composed and watchful face. And Alara watched her stepmother's expression arrange itself into the particular configuration of gracious condescension that she reserved for people she had categorized as beneath her notice. And you must be Edmund, Cecilia said, with a smile calibrated precisely to the warmth one offered a servant. I trust you are treating my stepdaughter adequately." Edmund looked at Cecilia with his steady, dark eyes and said, "I'm endeavoring to," in a tone of such perfect, unruffled courtesy that it was impossible to locate an insult in it, and equally impossible to feel entirely comfortable with it. Cecilia's smile remained fixed. She turned back to Alara and steered her toward the chairs by the window with a firm, possessive grip on her elbow that Alara recognized as her stepmother's method of establishing physical authority over space. "I shall have tea sent in from a carriage," Cecilia announced to the room in general. "I never trust strange kitchens." Edmund excused himself with quiet dignity and moved toward the small kitchen alcove, not retreating, Alara noted, but choosing his own position with the deliberateness of a man on a board who understands the value of geography. Cecilia leaned toward Alara the moment he was beyond clear earshot. Her voice dropped and her smile became something else entirely, satisfied, proprietary, edged with the particular pleasure she took in her own cleverness. "Well," she said softly, "you have settled in. I am glad you have found a way to be comfortable, Alara, despite the circumstances. It shows resilience." "Thank you," Alara said serenely. "He treats you decently enough?" It was asked with the studied lightness of someone who expected the answer to confirm suffering and was curious to measure the quantity of it. "Extremely well," Alara said. "He is considerate and well-read and provides a very comfortable domestic arrangement. I find I am content." She held Cecilia's gaze steadily and watched the satisfaction in her stepmother's eyes flicker and recalibrate. "Were you expecting otherwise?" Cecilia laughed, a bright, brittle sound. "Of course not. I arranged the match with your happiness in mind, naturally." "Naturally," Alara agreed. A silence stretched between them that was as comfortable as drawn wire. Cecilia's gaze drifted back toward the kitchen alcove, and Alara watched the thoughts moving behind her stepmother's eyes with the practiced attention of someone who had been reading that particular face for 3 years. There was something there that was not simply the cruelty of a woman checking on a trap she had set. There was something more anxious, more complex. Cecilia was looking at Edmund with the expression of someone who has done a thing they considered very clever and is beginning to experience the first cold whisper of doubt about whether they have, in fact, been clever at all. She knows something, Alara thought. She knows more about him than she revealed to me. The tea arrived, brought in by Cecilia's driver and arranged on the table with unnecessary ceremony, and Edmund returned from the kitchen and seated himself with quiet composure. And for the next 40 minutes Alara watched her stepmother conduct what presented itself as polite conversation and functioned in practice as an interrogation. She asked Edmund about his prospects, delicately, framed as interest. He answered with pleasant vagueness. She asked about his connections, who he knew in the county, whether he had family nearby. He replied that he was not much in society at present, which was entirely true and entirely uninformative. She asked, with the careful casualness of someone who has been waiting to ask a particular question, whether he had any plans to travel to London in the coming season. Edmund looked at her for a moment before answering. "Perhaps," he said. "I have business there that has been postponed." Something moved through Cecilia's expression, quick, almost invisible, gone before it could be named. But Alara named it anyway, internally and with precision. It was fear. Not the dramatic, gasping fear of someone confronted with immediate danger, but the subtle, creeping fear of a person who has made a calculated risk and has just received a small piece of information that suggests the calculation may have been incorrect. London. Business. Postponed. Cecilia departed an hour later, her composure immaculate and her eyes thoughtful. She embraced Alara at the door with the warmth of a woman performing maternal affection for an audience of one, and she pressed Alara's hands and said she would visit again soon and hoped everything continued to be satisfactory. As the carriage disappeared around the bend in the path, Alara stood at the open door with cold air moving against her face and her mind turning over everything she had observed with rapid, intent precision. Edmund appeared at her shoulder. Not close enough to intrude, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. "She is afraid of you," Alara said quietly. She came here expecting to find me ruined, and instead found me protected. And she does not understand the shape of what she has stumbled into. She turned to look at him. What has she stumbled into, Edmund? He was watching the empty road where the carriage had been, his expression thoughtful and remote. More than she intended, he said at last. She knows something about you, Elara pressed. She was not simply inspecting me. She was inspecting you. She was trying to determine whether she has made a terrible mistake. Edmund turned from the window and met her gaze, and in the pale winter light his eyes were darker and more serious than she had yet seen them, carrying something that might have been decision approaching its own threshold. She has made a mistake, he said quietly. The nature of it will become clear soon. I think, he stopped. He seemed to be weighing something. I think it is nearly time for you to have the explanation I have been withholding. Her heart moved with something swift and complicated in her chest. How nearly, she asked. He held her gaze for a long, considered moment. Soon, he said. And this time, the word held no evasion in it. It held instead the sound of a door that had been closed for a very long time, beginning at last to open. It was the village merchant who finally broke Edmund's composure, and Elara would find, in the weeks that followed, that she could not entirely regret it. His name was Groves, a broad, self-important man who ran the dry goods shop at the center of the village and conducted himself with the inflated authority of someone who had confused commercial necessity with social power. Elara had encountered him twice before in brief and unremarkable exchanges, and had formed a complete and unflattering assessment of him in approximately 4 minutes of total exposure, which she considered generous. It was a Wednesday, gray and cold with the particular sullen quality of late December that was neither fully winter nor willing to admit any softness, and Edmund had accompanied her to the village for the first time since their marriage, walking at her side on the slushed and refrozen path, with his crutch finding purchase on the uneven ground with practiced ease. She had not asked him to come. He had simply appeared at the door with his coat on when she reached for her own, and something about the naturalness of it, the quiet assumption of accompaniment, had made speech feel unnecessary. They had visited the post first, where Elara sent 2 letters, one to a school friend in Bath, whom Cecilia had progressively restricted her contact with over the past 3 years, and one to a solicitor whose name she had found in her father's old correspondence and committed to memory. Edmund had stood to one side during this, with his eyes on the middle distance, and had asked no questions, and she had been grateful for it in a way she could not have articulated without revealing more than she was ready to reveal. It was on their return through the village square that they encountered Groves. He was standing outside his shop with a younger man whom Elara did not recognize, and as they passed he spoke, loudly enough to be deliberate, not loudly enough to be undeniable, to his companion. There goes Ashwood's girl, he said. The one the stepmother married off to the cripple. Quite the fall for a lord's daughter, they say. Still beggars and choosers, I suppose. He laughed. His companion produced a sound somewhere between a laugh and an uncertainty about whether laughing was advisable. Elara did not stop walking. She had absorbed the words with a particular, seasoned steadiness of a woman who had been managing the corrosive effects of other people's cruelty for 3 years, and she had immediately resolved not to give Groves the satisfaction of a visible reaction, and she had taken 2 more steps along the path before she realized that Edmund was no longer beside her. She turned. He had stopped. He was standing very still in the center of the path, and he was looking at Groves with an expression that was not angry. Anger would have been easier. Anger was something Groves could have deflected with bluster, but instead carried a quality of absolute, quiet authority that was so completely at odds with his worn coat and his crutch that Elara watched Groves register the discordance and go slightly uncertain. I beg your pardon, Edmund said. His voice was very calm and very clear and carried across the square in the cold air without any effort. I did not hear you correctly. Would you care to repeat yourself? Groves blinked. He had the look of a man who had released a projectile and was now observing, with some unease, that it had not had the effect he intended. I meant no offense, he said, which was the defense of a man who knows he meant precisely offense. You referred to my wife, Edmund said. Still that same quality of voice, calm as deep water, and about as safe to underestimate. in terms that are neither accurate nor appropriate. You will not do so again. Groves began. I am not asking, Edmund said. I am informing you. There is a meaningful difference. He held Grove's gaze for a moment longer. The kind of look that requires a particular quality of person to deliver. The kind that comes from having spent a significant portion of one's life being looked at by people who needed to be answered rather than accommodated. And then he turned from the man as though he had ceased to be of any further interest, which was, Ilara thought, the most devastating possible conclusion to the exchange. He came to her side. They walked on. Groves said nothing. They were halfway back along the path to the cottage before Ilara trusted herself to speak. And what she discovered when she opened her mouth was that the thing she had been containing since the moment Edmund turned back and faced that man was considerably larger than she had appreciated while she was containing it. You did not need to do that, she said. Her voice was not quite as steady as she would have preferred. No, he agreed. I wanted to. She looked at him. He was watching the path ahead, his jaw set and the line of his shoulders carrying a tension that was slowly, visibly, releasing itself as they walked. He was not wrong, she said, because she found she needed to say it, needed to press on the bruise to determine its true extent. About the fall. About what it looks like to the world. What has become of me. A lord's daughter in a two-room cottage with a... Do not, he said, and something in his voice stopped her not because it was commanding, but because it was raw in a way she had not heard from him before. Genuinely, briefly, unguardedly raw. Do not finish that sentence the way he would have finished it. She looked at him and found he had turned to look at her, and the distance between them on the narrow path was not great to begin with and seemed to have diminished without either of them moving. How would you finish it? She asked softly. He held her gaze, and something moved through his expression that she had seen approaching in fragments over the past weeks, through the shared evenings by the fire and the storm's enforced intimacy and the gradual, reluctant dissolution of his careful walls. And it arrived now all at once, with the quiet force of something that has been building below a surface for longer than the surface was aware of. He lifted his hand, his right hand, the scarred one, and he touched her face. Not with urgency or presumption, but with the extraordinary gentleness of someone who is not entirely certain they have the right, and is proceeding with corresponding care. His fingers rested at her jaw, barely there, a question rather than a statement. She did not move away. His eyes dropped briefly to her mouth and returned to her eyes, and in the suspended, breathless silence of that winter path with the bare trees on either side and the gray sky pressing close, she understood that he was going to kiss her, and she understood with equal clarity that she was going to let him. And the combination of these two understandings produced in her chest a warmth so sudden and complete that it was almost frightening. He was close enough now. His breath was visible in the cold air between them, and his eyes were searching hers with an expression that was equal parts desire and something more serious than desire, something that asked, without words, a question she felt herself leaning toward answering. Then he stopped. His hand remained at her jaw for one more suspended second. Then it dropped, and he stepped back, and he closed his eyes briefly in the manner of a man exercising a restraint that cost him something real. No, he said quietly, and the word was directed at himself as much as at the situation. Not yet. She stood very still. The cold reasserted itself. Edmund. You deserve the truth first, he said. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and what she saw in them was not rejection, but something far more complicated, and, she found, far more affecting than a simple kiss would have been. All of it. Before you give me anything, before I allow myself to, you deserve to know who I am, what I am. And then, if you choose to, he stopped. He exhaled. Then you choose with full knowledge. Not before. She looked at him for a long time in the winter light, at this impossible man with his worn coat and his scarred hand and his impenetrable dignity, and she felt something resolve within her with a quiet, definitive quality, not resignation, but something closer to decision. Then tell me, she said. Tell me now, Edmund. I am tired of not knowing. He looked at her steadily. Tonight, he said. I will tell you tonight. I give you my word. She held his gaze and found she believed him. She had not expected to believe him so completely, but the word in his mouth had the weight of something that had not been offered carelessly. They walked back to the cottage in silence, and it was a different silence than any they had shared before, not guarded, not careful, but anticipatory, charged. The silence of a conversation that has already begun and is simply waiting for its words to arrive. That evening, Edmund sat at the table for a long time after supper with paper and pen before him. Alara did not ask what he was writing. She read her book by the fire or appeared to read it, and at some point she heard the pen moving across the paper with decisive, continuous strokes, not the hesitant scratching of a man composing a difficult letter, but the swift, certain hand of someone writing what they have long known they needed to write and have finally allowed themselves to begin. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bedroom and listened to the silence on the other side of the door and thought about his hand at her jaw and the look in his eyes in the moment before he stepped back. And she thought about Cecilia's fear and the London man's bow and the embossed wax seal on the parcel. And she assembled the pieces once more with the patient, relentless care she had been applying to them for weeks. And this time, she allowed herself to arrive at the conclusion. She lay in the dark with a conclusion, sitting fully formed in her mind, enormous and impossible and somehow inexplicably, feeling less like a shock than like a recognition. The particular recognition of something one has known below the surface for longer than one has been willing to admit. She waited for morning with her heart very full and her hands very still and the quiet, certain knowledge that everything was about to change. Morning came slowly, the way mornings do when they are carrying something significant, gray at first, then pale gold, then a clear and particular winter light that fell through the cottage windows and lay across the table in long, still rectangles, illuminating the single folded piece of paper that Edmund had left at Alara's place before she woke. She found it when she emerged from the bedroom, wrapped in her cloak against the morning chill, her hair loose and her eyes carrying the shadows of a sleepless night. Edmund was at the hearth, his back to her, tending the fire with his usual quiet competence. He did not turn when she entered. He was giving her the letter first. She understood this and was grateful for it. She sat. She picked up the paper. It was folded once, her name written across the front in a hand that was precise and elegant and entirely inconsistent with every fiction of lowly circumstance he had ever presented. She looked at that handwriting for a moment, just her name, for letters, and yet containing in their careful formation the whole weight of what she had spent weeks suspecting. And then she unfolded it and read. He had not written at great length. He was not, she had learned, a man who used words to obscure. He used them to clarify, and when he had nothing clarifying to say, he preferred silence to noise. And so the letter was perhaps 200 words and contained, in those 200 words, more truth than she had been offered in the entirety of their acquaintance. His full name was Edmund George Cavendish. He was the 5th Duke of Ashenmore, holder of estates in Wiltshire, Derbyshire, and the northern counties, with a principal seat at Ashenmore Castle 12 miles northeast of where they currently sat. He had been living in deliberate concealment for 11 months, following an attempt on his life that had been organized, he had reason to believe, by persons connected to his former betrothed and her family, who stood to benefit considerably from his death and the resulting complications in the line of succession to the dukedom. The injury to his leg was genuine, sustained in the same incident. The poverty was not. He had arranged a marriage through Cecilia Ashwood because Cecilia had approached his solicitor with a proposal she believed to be mutually advantageous. She wished to dispose of her stepdaughter quietly and permanently, and had been told that a gentleman of private means required a wife of good family for reasons of legal and social protection during his period of concealment. Cecilia had not known his true identity. She had believed she was marrying Alara to a disgraced minor gentleman of modest estate. She had been wrong. The letter ended with a single paragraph that Alara read 3 times. "I did not anticipate you," it said. "I did not anticipate your intelligence or your dignity or the particular quality of your courage, which is not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet, daily kind that I have come to understand is considerably rarer and considerably more admirable. I intended this arrangement to be a practical matter, concluded cleanly when the danger had passed and dissolved without damage to either party. I find I can no longer pretend that is what I want. I find I want something else entirely, and you deserve to know that before you are asked to decide anything. I am sorry for the deception. I am sorrier than I know how to adequately express. E.C. She folded the letter carefully along its original crease. She held it in both hands on the table before her and sat very still, the fire warming the room and the morning light shifting across the floor and Edmund's back remaining turned with the patient, almost unbearable courtesy of a man giving her whatever time she needed. She found, less time than she might have expected. The conclusion she had arrived at in the dark had been correct. The pieces assembled themselves now into a picture that was complete and clear and carried with it, paradoxically, a sense of settling, as though the dissonances she had been cataloging for weeks had finally resolved into a chord that, whatever its complexity, was at least coherent. Edmund, she said. He turned. His face was composed but not impenetrable, not in the way it had been in the early days. He had opened something in the writing of that letter and had not closed it again, and she could see the openness in him like light beneath a door. Edmund George Cavendish, she said carefully. The 5th Duke of Ashmore. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The cottage, she said. 12 miles from your own estate. Yes. And the man in the London coat who bowed to you. My secretary, he said. He has been managing the dukedom in my absence. He comes monthly with correspondence that cannot wait, and the parcel with the wax seal. Legal documents requiring my signature. And the sovereign you gave the village boy. Something moved through his expression, almost wry, almost pained. An oversight, he said. I have occasional difficulty remembering what denomination is appropriate to the fiction. She looked down at the folded letter in her hands. You were nearly killed, she said, and the words came out quieter than she intended, carrying a weight she had not planned to reveal so readily. Yes, he said simply. And the woman, your former betrothed, she arranged it. She and her brother. They had accumulated debts against an inheritance they expected to receive through the marriage. And when I ended the engagement, having discovered the nature of her character some months before the attempt, they found themselves in a position that apparently motivated extreme measures. He paused. I survived. They believe otherwise, or did until recently. The concealment has served its purpose. And now, she asked. And now, he said, I have people gathering the evidence necessary to ensure they do not have a second opportunity. The work is nearly complete. I will be able to step out of the shadows within the month. He held her gaze steadily. Which means you will need to decide very soon what you wish to do. What I wish to do, she repeated. The marriage is legal, he said, and his voice was careful now, carrying equal weight on both sides of what he was about to say. But it was contracted under circumstances that were not fully transparent to you. I have consulted with my solicitor. There are grounds for dissolution if you wish to pursue them, and I would ensure you were provided for fully and permanently, in a manner that protected you from Cecilia and restored every material thing that should rightfully have been yours. He paused. I would do that willingly, Alara, without resentment, if that is your choice. She stood. She crossed the room to the shelf where the books were and stood with her back to him for a moment, her hand resting on the spine of the Keats volume. And she thought about standing at a freezing altar in a chapel that smelled of tallow and damp stone. And she thought about 3 days of storm and firelight. And she thought about his hand at her jaw on the winter path. And she thought about 200 words that had managed to contain more honesty than most people offered in a lifetime. She turned to face him. In the letter, she said, you said you intended to dissolve the marriage when the danger had passed. You said you find you can no longer pretend that is what you want. She held his gaze. I want you to say that aloud. Not in a letter. To my face. Something moved through him. She could see it pass through his frame from shoulders to jaw. A brief and visible struggle between the habit of restraint and the force of what was straining against it. I do not want to dissolve it, he said. His voice was low and direct and entirely unguarded. and every word carried the weight of a man who had spent 11 months behind careful walls, saying something that required him to step completely beyond them. I want you to stay. I want to deserve you staying. He stopped. He exhaled. I want to court you properly, if you will allow it. To give you the truth of who I am and ask, with full transparency and no further deception, whether you could find it possible to remain my wife. Not the wife of a fiction. The wife of the man in that letter. The room was very quiet. The fire was the only sound. Ilara looked at Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Ashmore, the man who had made her breakfast every morning for 3 weeks, who had read Keats by firelight and made soup during a snowstorm and faced a village bully on a winter path with a crutch and a quiet authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with character. And she felt the decision forming within her not as a conclusion reached through deliberation, but as a recognition of something that had been true for longer than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. You're going to have a great deal to answer for, she said. The deception. The weeks of deliberate vagueness. The sovereign you gave a 12-year-old boy, as though it were a penny. The corner of his mouth moved. I am aware. And I'm going to have questions, she said. Many of them. About the estate and the title and the woman who tried to have you killed and what precisely a duchess is expected to do with her mornings. I will answer every one of them, he said. She held his gaze for one last long, measuring moment. Then yes, she said quietly. I will stay. It was not a grand declaration. It was not accompanied by any dramatic gesture or sweeping sentiment. It was simply 2 words offered directly by a woman who had learned through considerable difficulty to mean precisely what she said. Edmund closed his eyes for just a moment, briefly and completely, in the manner of a man receiving something he had not been certain he had the right to hope for. When he opened them again, they were dark and warm and more open than she had yet seen them. Outside, the winter morning continued its pale and ordinary business. A bird moved in the bare elm by the gate. The fire settled in the hearth with a soft collapse of embers. And in a 2-room cottage 12 miles from Ashmore Castle, a duke and a woman who had been tricked into marrying him stood on the other side of the truth at last, with everything still to be navigated and nothing left to hide. The peace lasted 3 days. Ilara would reflect on this afterward with a kind of rueful precision. 3 days of something that was not quite courtship and not quite ordinary domestic life, but something suspended beautifully between the two. A fragile and luminous interval in which she and Edmund moved through the cottage with a new and tentative openness, speaking more freely, laughing occasionally, allowing themselves the small and extraordinary luxury of simply being known by another person without the mediation of careful performance. He told her about Ashmore Castle, the great hall with its vaulted ceilings and the library that occupied the entire east wing, the formal gardens that his mother had designed and that had been left somewhat to their own devices since her death, the tenant families on the estate whom he knew by name and worried about during the months of his absence. He spoke of these things with a warmth and specificity that told her they were not the abstract possessions of a man cataloging his wealth, but the genuine attachments of someone who understood that land and title carried obligations of care rather than simply privileges of ownership. She told him, in return, about her father's house before Cecilia had rearranged it to her own preferences, the rose garden her mother had planted along the south wall, the library where she had spent whole winter afternoons reading beside the fire while her father worked at his desk, the particular quality of summer evenings in Wiltshire, when the light came low and golden through the drawing-room windows, and the world felt, briefly and completely, like enough. She had not spoken of these things aloud before, not to anyone, and the speaking of them produced in her chest a complicated mixture of grief and relief that she had not anticipated. Edmund listened with his full attention, which he had come to understand was not a courtesy he extended reflexively, but a quality he possessed genuinely, the capacity to be entirely present to what was being said, without distraction or performance, giving it the weight it deserved. They were, she thought, learning each other, properly at last. And then the peace ended, as peace tends to end, not with warning, but with a knock at the door on the 3rd morning. It was Edmund's secretary, the London man, whose name she now knew was Mr. Hargrove, and he brought with him a leather document case and an expression of professional discretion that did not entirely conceal his underlying concern. Edmund received him at the table while Alara sat at the window with a book, and though she kept her eyes on the pages, she was aware, with the peripheral attention she had developed to a considerable acuity during her years with Cecilia, that the conversation being conducted in low voices across the room contained something troubling. Hargrove departed 20 minutes later. Edmund remained at the table with a document before him, his hand resting flat on the surface beside it, not moving. Alara waited. "There is a complication," Edmund said at last. "Tell me," she said. He turned in his chair to face her. "Lady Cecilia has engaged a solicitor. She is contesting the terms of your father's estate, specifically the clause that would have transferred primary control to you upon your marriage. She is arguing that the marriage was contracted under conditions that render it legally irregular, and therefore the transfer cannot stand." He paused. "She has been thorough. The argument has some technical merit, apparently, depending on which judge reviews it." Alara set her book down carefully. She felt the familiar cold clarity that arrived whenever Cecilia moved against her, not panic, but a sharp, clean focus that had been her primary defense mechanism for 3 years. "She has discovered who you are," she said. "Hargrove believes so, or she suspects it sufficiently to be taking precautions." Edmund's jaw was set. "She's trying to move before I can." "Before you can what?" "Before I can use my position to protect what is yours." His eyes met hers directly. "Your father's estate, Alara. The house, the grounds, the income. Cecilia has been drawing from it for 3 years, as though it were her own. Much of what she has drawn should by rights have been yours. I intend to ensure you recover it." Something moved through her at that, not gratitude, or not only gratitude, but something more complicated. Something that had been moving toward a breaking point for several days, building below the surface of the tentative new peace they had constructed, and which was now arriving. "Edmund," she said, and her voice had a different quality in it, one he had not heard before, or not in this form. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Always," he said. "When you arranged a marriage, when you agreed to Cecilia's proposal, did you know about my father's estate? Did you know what she had done to me?" He was very still. "I knew she was a woman of predatory character who wished to remove her stepdaughter from the picture." Hargrove had assessed the situation at a surface level. He paused, and she could see the precision with which he was choosing his words, neither overstating nor understating. "I did not know the full extent of what had been taken from you. I did not know about the forged documents or the diverted income or the systematic nature of it. I learned these things gradually, as I came to know you." "But you knew enough," she said. "You knew she was using me. And you allowed yourself to be used in the same arrangement." "Yes," he said. "I did." The word fell between them with the weight he had intended it to carry, unqualified, undeflected, accepted, without evasion. And it was precisely this quality, the refusal to mitigate it, to explain it away, to offer self-justification, that caused something inside Alara to fracture along a seam she had not known was under pressure. She stood and moved to the window, and stood with her back to him, her arms folded across her chest, and the cold glass close to her face, and the bare winter garden blurred slightly beyond it. "You let me believe," she said, and her voice was quiet, but its edges had a precision that was sharper than raised volume would have been, "that I had been destroyed. That Cecilia had succeeded. I woke up in this cottage as your wife, knowing nothing about you, believing that my life as I had understood it was finished. I spent weeks." "I know," he said. "I spent weeks frightened and humiliated and trying to maintain enough dignity to survive it, not knowing whether the man I had been tricked into marrying was dangerous, or cruel, or—" She stopped. She pressed her fingers briefly against the cold window glass. "And you knew, from the beginning, that you were not what you appeared. You knew that I was someone who had been wronged. And you chose for weeks to maintain the fiction." "Yes," he said again, and his voice was low and entirely without defense. She turned to face him then, and he met her eyes without flinching, And what she saw in his face was not the expression of a man preparing to argue his case, but the expression of a man who had already found himself guilty and was prepared to accept whatever sentence she delivered. This, paradoxically, made her fury more complex. It was far easier to be angry with someone who deflected. The anger had somewhere to go. It could follow the deflection, pursue the excuse, sustain itself on the chase. Edmund's absolute, unflinching acceptance of her anger had the effect of removing its target and leaving her standing in the middle of it with nothing to push against, which forced her to examine what was beneath it. What was beneath it, she found, was not only anger. "I was alone," she said, and her voice shifted on the last word in a way she had not intended. A slight, involuntary unevenness that revealed the thing she had been carrying below the anger and the practicality and the daily managed dignity for much longer than the 3 weeks of this marriage. "I have been alone since my father died, in a house full of people who wished me gone, managing myself very carefully, trying not to give anything away. And when I arrived here I was still alone, only more so, because I had been removed even from the familiar shapes of my captivity and placed in a strange cottage with a stranger, and I had to start all over again with nothing." She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. I am not asking for your pity. I am asking you to understand what the weeks of concealment cost me. Not materially, not legally, personally. Edmund had risen from a table. He was standing several feet from her with his weight on his crutch and his eyes on hers, and the expression on his face had passed beyond guilt into something else, something that was not performed or calculated, but simply and undisguisedly felt. "I understand," he said. "I understand it precisely because I know what it is to be alone in a particular and profound way, to have people present and be unreachable by any of them. And I chose, knowing this about myself, knowing something of it in you, to prolong it. Because I was afraid." His voice was very steady, but the steadiness was the steadiness of control, not of indifference. "I was afraid that if you knew the truth you would leave, or that I would be required to let you go for your own protection. And I found—" He stopped. He exhaled. "I found I had become entirely unwilling to do that," he said. "Which was not fair to you. Which was not a justification. It is simply the truth of what happened." She looked at him across the small space of the cottage, this room that had contained them both for 3 weeks, that had held the silence of their early wariness, and the slow thaw of the storm, and the charged unreleased tension of a kiss that had not happened. And she thought about the 200 words of his letter, and the way he had said, "I did not anticipate you," with a plainness that had moved through her like winter light. The anger was still there. She was not pretending. It had dissolved. But it had been joined now by something that she was no longer willing to pretend she did not feel, something that had been building through every shared evening and every careful exchange, and every moment he had chosen to treat her with a respect and consideration she had not encountered in 3 years. "You hurt me," she said, "with the concealment. I need you to know that." "I know it," he said. "And it cannot happen again," she said. "Whatever comes next, the estate, the title, Cecilia, the people who try to kill you, I will not be managed or protected from information. I will not be handled. I have been handled for 3 years, and I will not tolerate it from you." "You have my word," he said, and the word in his mouth meant what she had learned it meant. Complete transparency from this moment. Everything. She looked at him for a long, last, measuring moment. Then she crossed the room toward him, not impulsively, not dramatically, but with the deliberate and decided quality that characterized everything she did when she had made up her mind. And she stopped before him and looked up at his face with the winter light falling across both of them and said quietly, "Then stop waiting for permission, Edmund." He looked at her for one suspended, searching second, and then he cupped her face in both hands with extraordinary gentleness, and he kissed her. It was not the frantic kiss of people who have been waiting too long and are now compensating for the wait. It was something quieter and more considered than that, careful at first, then deepening, then carrying in it the full weight of everything the past weeks had contained, every careful silence, and every guarded word, and every moment of almost, arriving at last at simply this. When they separated, His forehead rested against hers, and his eyes were closed, and his hands were still at her face, and the cottage was very quiet. "I'm going to make this right," he said softly. "All of it. Everything Cecilia has taken. Everything you should have had. I give you my word." She placed her hand briefly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of him beneath her palm, and said nothing, because nothing was needed. Outside, the first pale suggestion of spring moved in the bare branches of the elm by the gate, a single bud, barely visible, entirely certain. The documents arrived on a Monday, and they were, Alara thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They came in a leather case delivered by two men, one Edmund solicitor, a precise and capable man named Mr. Aldworth, who wore spectacles and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had learned long ago that accuracy was more powerful than drama, and one a king's messenger, whose presence indicated a level of official sanction that made the whole proceedings feel less like a private dispute and more like the inexorable turning of a very large and very well-maintained wheel. Edmund received them at the table. Alara sat beside him, not across from him, not at a polite and separate distance, but beside him because he had asked her to, and because she had decided, in the days since the kiss and the confrontation and the particular quality of the new understanding that had settled between them like cleared weather, that she was done removing herself to the margins of her own life. She read every document as Aldworth presented it. Edmund did not summarize for her or explain in simplified terms. He passed each page directly to her when he was finished and waited while she read, and occasionally she asked a question, and Aldworth answered it with the same precision he extended to Edmund, and the whole proceeding had about it the quality of a thing being done correctly, with full regard for all the parties actually present. The documents told a story that Alara had suspected in fragments and could now see entire. Cecilia had begun her work before Lord Ashwood had drawn his final breath. A codicil to the estate management agreement, introduced during the confusion of his last illness, and signed by a man whose faculties were, according to two physicians who had since provided affidavits, significantly compromised by fever, had transferred operational control of the estate to Cecilia in terms that were far broader than any honest reading of the original will would have allowed. From this single document, Cecilia had constructed 3 years of methodical extraction, redirected income, sold assets, forged correspondence in Lord Ashwood's name authorizing expenditures that had no basis in reality. The estate had not been drained entirely. Cecilia was too intelligent for that, understanding that a completely emptied vessel attracted scrutiny, but it had been diminished systematically, its resources diverted into accounts that Aldworth's investigators had spent 4 months patiently following through layers of deliberate obscuring. The money was in 3 places. 2 had already been frozen by court order. The 3rd would be by Thursday. She knew, Alara said, when she had read the final document and set it down. Her voice was quiet and even. She knew from the beginning, before my father was even gone. It appears so, Aldworth said, with the particular neutrality of someone who has ceased to be surprised by human nature. And the codicil, the forged authorization. There is sufficient evidence. Sufficient for the courts, yes. The handwriting analysis alone is compelling, and combined with the physician's affidavits and the testimony of your father's personal secretary, who has proved remarkably forthcoming since being approached, Aldworth permitted himself a small, dry expression that was not quite a smile. The case is robust. Alara placed her hand flat on the documents before her. What happens to her? That depends on several factors, Aldworth said carefully. The courts will determine the criminal question. What we are positioned to ensure, regardless of the criminal proceedings, is the full restoration of the estate to its rightful management, the recovery of the diverted funds to the greatest extent possible, and the legal clarification of your position as Lady Ashwood. He paused. And, of course, as Her Grace the Duchess of Ashmore, which provides a degree of protection and authority that considerably simplifies a number of these questions. Alara absorbed this with the particular stillness she employed when something large required to be taken in gradually rather than all at once. Edmund, beside her, said nothing. He had been watching her throughout the proceedings with a quiet, complete attention that was characteristically his. And she was aware of his steadiness beside her as something that was not intrusive, but simply present, a kind of anchor that she was learning to accept without the reflex of self-sufficiency that 3 years of isolation had built so thoroughly into her. "I want to be there," she said. Aldworth looked up. "Your Grace." "When it is done," she said. "When the documents are served. When Cecilia is formally notified. I want to be present." She looked at Aldworth directly, not to be cruel, not for the satisfaction of her humiliation, but because she arranged my disposal as though I were an inconvenience to be managed, and I think it is important, for reasons that are mine, that she see me standing when it is finished. Aldworth looked briefly at Edmund, who gave a slight nod. "That can be arranged," Aldworth said. The notification was served on a Thursday afternoon. Cecilia received them in the drawing room of Lord Ashwood's estate, Alara's estate, and Alara noted, as they were shown in, that the room had been redecorated since her father's time. The old blue curtains her mother had chosen were gone, replaced with something in dark green that was fashionable and expensive and entirely wrong for the proportions of the windows. A portrait of her father had been moved from its position above the mantelpiece to a dim corner near the door, replaced by a large mirror that Cecilia had presumably preferred to the alternative of being watched by a dead man while she conducted her affairs. Cecilia was already standing when they entered, which meant she had been warned of their arrival and had composed herself. She wore a deep red dress, and her expression was the one Alara knew best, the social mask, the gracious surface, calibrated to the precise wattage appropriate to receiving unexpected visitors of uncertain standing. Then she saw Edmund. The mask did not fall entirely. Cecilia was too practiced for that. But it shifted, and beneath the shift something moved that Alara recognized with cold clarity as the specific fear of a person who has gambled on a single crucial misapprehension and has just understood that the misapprehension was wrong. Edmund was not wearing the worn coat. He was dressed as befitted his station. Dark wool of excellent cut, clean linen. The crutch the same, but somehow carrying differently against clothes that corresponded to the authority that had always been evident in his posture. He was unmistakably and entirely a man of consequence, and anyone who looked at him now in this drawing room would see it immediately and understand that they had always been looking at it in the cottage, on the path, across the table, and that not seeing it sooner had been a failure of observation, not a failure of evidence. "Lady Cecilia," Aldworth said, stepping forward with the document case. "I am Mr. Aldworth, solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Ashmore. I have documents requiring your immediate attention." Cecilia's eyes moved from Aldworth to Edmund to Alara, and in that brief, rapid transit Alara watched her stepmother's mind working with a swift, assessing quality she had always possessed, measuring, calculating, determining whether there was a position from which to maneuver. There was not. She knew it within seconds. Alara could see the moment she understood it, a slight, involuntary change in her breathing, a barely perceptible settling of the shoulders that was not relaxation, but the physical acknowledgement of the absence of exit. "Alara," she said, and her voice was composed, perhaps admirably so. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Alara said, and was pleased to find her voice entirely steady, carrying nothing vindictive and nothing wounded, simply clear, "is that my husband's solicitor has been thorough, and my father's secretary has been honest, and the courts have been appropriately interested in the results of both." She paused. "You should read the documents, Cecilia. Aldworth will wait." Cecilia read them. She stood very straight and very still while she read them, and she did not perform shock or outrage or any of the theatrical responses that a lesser person might have reached for. She was, Alara conceded internally, possessed of a genuine self-command that might have been admirable in the service of better purposes. When she finished, she set the documents on the side table with a controlled precision and looked up. She looked at Edmund. "I did not know who you were," she said. It was not quite an apology and not quite an accusation. It was the statement of someone establishing a fact they considered relevant to their defense. "No," Edmund said. "You did not." His voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. "You believed you were disposing of a young woman of no consequence to a man of no consequence." The precise identity of either party was not your primary concern. Your primary concern was the estate. Cecilia's jaw tightened fractionally. The estate will be restored, Edmund continued. The diverted funds, to the extent recoverable, will be returned. The codicil will be struck. The criminal question will be decided by the courts, and I will not interfere in that process in either direction. He paused. What I will tell you is this. My wife has asked me not to pursue the matter beyond what justice requires. Not from weakness. From a quality of character considerably better than the situation perhaps warrants. He looked at Cecilia steadily. I would suggest you recognize the value of that. Cecilia looked at Alara then for a long moment, and what moved through her expression in that moment was more complex than anything Alara had expected. There was the fear, still, and beneath it, the remains of calculation. But there was also something else, something that took Alara a moment to identify precisely, because she had not expected to find it in this woman's face. It was, she thought, something close to the recognition of a mirror held at an unwelcome angle. Cecilia had made herself from ambition and self-preservation and the management of other people as instruments of her own advancement. She had looked at Alara and seen an obstacle. She had never, at any point, looked at her and seen a person. And standing here now, with the documents on the table and the Duke at Alara's side, and the whole careful structure of 3 years of work coming apart with the quiet inevitability of ice and spring, Cecilia Ashwood looked at her stepdaughter and saw her, perhaps for the first time, and found the experience, Alara suspected, not entirely comfortable. You will have until Monday to vacate the house, Aldworth said, with the manner of a man closing a meeting. They left in the pale afternoon light, the three of them, and Alara walked down the front steps of her father's house with her back very straight and the winter air clean and cold against her face, and she did not look back. Edmund fell into step beside her on the path, his crutch finding the familiar rhythm of their shared walking, and after a moment his free hand found hers and held it, not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply and surely, the way a man holds something he intends to keep. She let him. She held back with equal certainty. Are you all right? He asked after a while. She considered the question with genuine attention. The house was behind her. Her father's portrait was in a dim corner. The blue curtains were gone. 3 years of careful daily endurance had arrived at this cold Thursday afternoon on a gravel path with the Duke's hand in hers, and justice, served not in fire and fury, but in documents and steadiness and the patient, relentless work of people who were on her side. Yes, she said, and meant it entirely. I think I finally am. Ashenmore Castle revealed itself slowly, the way things of genuine grandeur often do, not in a single dramatic declaration, but in increments, each bend of the long approach road offering a slightly fuller view until the whole of it was suddenly, completely present against the gray February sky, and Alara found she had stopped breathing for a moment without entirely deciding to. It was not the largest house she had ever seen. She had visited estates in her childhood that were wider, longer, more aggressively imposing in the manner of buildings designed primarily to communicate their owner's importance to anyone who approached. Ashenmore was something different. It had the settled, unhurried quality of a place that had stood long enough to stop needing to prove anything. Stone walls the color of winter honey, for towers of unequal height that suggested organic growth rather than architectural plan. Tall windows that caught the pale light and returned it with a warmth the season did not entirely account for. It looked, she thought, like somewhere a person could actually live. Edmund was watching her from the opposite seat of the carriage with the particular expression she had come to recognize as his version of anticipation, contained, almost entirely concealed, visible only in the slight additional stillness that came over him when he was waiting for something that mattered. Well, he said. It is not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? She considered. Something more forbidding, she said. Something that matched the title more precisely. Turrets and shadows and the general atmosphere of Gothic warning. Something moved through his expression that was unmistakably a smile. Not the ghost of one that she had become familiar with in the early weeks. An actual, full, unguarded smile that altered his face so completely she felt the impact of it somewhere in the region of her sternum. It happened rarely enough that she had not yet grown accustomed to it. The east wing has shadows, he offered. And there's one turret that makes a particularly unsettling sound in high wind. I can arrange for Gothic warning if you feel strongly about it. I will reserve judgment, she said. The household staff had assembled in the entrance hall, not the full complement, Edmund had explained, many of whom had been redistributed to other Cavendish properties during his absence, but a core of approximately 15 people who had remained and maintained the castle through the 11 months of concealment. They stood in the entrance hall with a mixture of barely suppressed relief and formal composure, and when Edmund walked through the door, the relief won, briefly and completely, before professionalism reasserted itself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, a woman of 60 with a spine of absolute rectitude and eyes that were kind beneath their efficiency, stepped forward and curtsied with a depth that contained in it, Ilara thought, not merely deference, but genuine warmth. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice held a quality that caused Edmund to pause and look at her for a moment with an expression Ilara could not fully read. "Mrs. Pierce," he said, "it is very good to be back." He introduced Ilara simply and directly. Her name, her new title, his expectation that she would be treated with every courtesy. And the staff received this information with a composed acceptance of people who had decided to trust their employer's judgment and were proceeding accordingly. Mrs. Pierce looked at Ilara with the swift, assessing quality of a woman who had managed great houses long enough to form accurate impressions rapidly, and whatever she assessed appeared to satisfy her, because something in her posture shifted from professional readiness to something warmer. "Welcome to Ashenmore, Your Grace," she said. Ilara thought of the two-room cottage and the narrow bed and the shelf of 20 books and the single hearth that had been, improbably and completely, the location of the most transformative weeks of her life. "Thank you," she said. "I am very glad to be here." The first weeks at Ashenmore were a kind of education she had not anticipated, not in the management of grand houses, which she understood in principle and learned in practice with relative ease, but in the specific and layered education of becoming a person she had not previously had room to be. At her father's house, she had been a daughter in mourning, then a stepdaughter under management, then a woman marking time between constraint and the next constraint. She had developed, in those years, an extraordinary capacity for internal life, for finding freedom in books and thought and the private world of her own mind, because the external world had been so thoroughly managed against her. She had been, without entirely recognizing it until it was over, a person living primarily in the interior. Ashenmore gave her the exterior back. The library in the East Wing was precisely as Edmund had described, enormous, 2 stories high, smelling of leather and time, and the specific, ineffable quality of rooms where serious thought had been conducted for generations. She spent whole mornings in it, not hiding, but genuinely inhabiting, moving through the shelves with the particular pleasure of a person reunited with their natural environment. Edmund found her there often and would settle in the chair by the window with his own reading, and they would spend hours in the comfortable, inhabited silence that had first developed between them in a much smaller room on the other side of winter. She took up the management of the tenant correspondence, not because it was assigned to her, but because she asked about it, and Edmund showed her the ledgers and the letters with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to everything. And she found within a week that she had genuine aptitude for it, and within a month that the tenant families had begun addressing their letters to her by name. She replanted the formal gardens in her mother-in-law's original design, which she found in a leather folder in the library archive. This was not a grand gesture. It was simply something that needed doing and that she found she wanted to do. And Edmund stood in the frost one February morning watching the first soil being turned and looked at her with an expression she had no single word for. It was admiration and something tender and something that was simply and unambiguously love. And she had stopped pretending, some weeks since, that she did not feel it returned. It was on a Tuesday in early March that Edmund asked to meet her in the great hall before supper, which was unusual enough in its formality to make her pause at the top of the stairs for a moment before descending. He was standing in the center of the great hall, a room of vaulted ceilings and stone floors and tall windows that looked west toward the darkening sky, and he was not leaning on the crutch. He was standing beside it, his hand resting on it as a support rather than a necessity, and he had clearly been standing there for some time, working something through. He was dressed well, dark coat, clean linen. The particular careful attention to appearance that she had noticed he reserved for occasions he considered significant. His hair was neat. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, stripped of every layer of protection and control until what remained was simply him, entirely present, offering nothing defended and nothing withheld. She descended the remaining stairs and crossed the hall toward him and stopped before him and waited, because she could see that what was coming required him to arrive at it in his own time. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the night of the ceremony." "In the chapel," she said. "Yes. You stood at that altar in a freezing chapel, and you married a stranger who had not told you the truth about anything. And you did it with more dignity than the situation deserved. And you have continued to conduct yourself with that same dignity through every subsequent difficulty, including the difficulties that were directly my fault." He paused. "You deserve a great deal better than the beginning I gave you." "Edmund," she began. "I am not finished," he said, gently but firmly. And she closed her mouth. "What I want to give you, what I am asking you properly to accept, is not a correction of a legal document or a restoration of what was taken or a title to compensate for circumstances. Those things are done. They belong to the past." He held her gaze with the absolute steadiness that was most fundamentally and characteristically himself. "What I am asking for is the future, freely given, with full knowledge of who I am and what I am asking, and no further concealment of anything ever, for as long as we both live." He did something then that she had not expected. He moved the crutch to his left hand and lowered himself to one knee, slowly, with the careful management of a man for whom this gesture required real effort, and who was making it anyway, precisely because it required real effort, because the requiring of effort made it mean something. And he looked up at her from the stone floor of the great hall, with the winter light coming through the tall windows behind her, and his eyes entirely undefended. "Elara Ashwood Cavendish," he said. "Will you be my wife? Not by arrangement, not by deception, not by a ceremony in a cold chapel with no honest foundation. By choice. By your own free and fully informed choice." She looked down at him. This man who had made her breakfast in a cottage while pretending to be a beggar, who had faced a village bully with a crutch and a duke's authority and never once mentioned the disproportion, who had written 200 words that told the truth when it would have been easier to continue saying nothing, who had lowered himself to one knee on a stone floor because he believed the gesture was owed to her even at physical cost to himself. She felt the full weight of everything the past months had contained. The freezing chapel and the worn coat and the snowbound cottage and the firelit evenings and the confrontation and the kiss and Cecilia's face as the documents were served and the first sight of Ashenmore against the winter sky. And she felt it resolve. The whole complicated and difficult and unexpectedly extraordinary accumulation of it into this single clear moment. "Get up," she said softly, and held out her hand to him. He took it, and she helped him to his feet. And when he was standing before her again, she kept her hand in his and looked up at his face and said, "Yes. Absolutely and entirely yes. Now and without reservation." He exhaled, a breath she thought he might have been holding for longer than the length of this conversation, and his free hand came to her face with the same extraordinary gentleness that had undone her on a winter path. And he pressed his forehead to hers for a moment with his eyes closed and the whole great quiet hall holding them both. "Thank you," he said softly. "Don't thank me," she said. "I am getting the better part of this arrangement, and we both know it." He pulled back and looked at her and laughed, genuinely, fully, with the unguarded completeness of a man who has set down something very heavy and discovered, in the setting down, that his hands are free. She thought she had never heard a more welcome sound in her life. Outside, the last of winter was losing its argument with March, and the formal garden below the west window held in its newly turned soil the patient certainty of everything that had been planted and was coming, in its own time, to bloom. There is a particular kind of story that the world tells about women who are wronged. It is a story of damage, of a person reduced by cruelty, defined by what was taken from them, measured primarily by the depth of the wound and the length of the recovery. It is a story that means well often, but it makes the mistake of centering the harm rather than the person. And in doing so, it grants the people who cause the harm a power over the narrative that they do not deserve to hold. A Lara Ashwood story is not that story. It is true that she was wronged. It is true that she stood in a freezing chapel in November and was handed to a stranger by a woman who had spent 3 years dismantling everything her father had built and everything he had loved. And it is true that she stood there without full knowledge of what she was walking into, and that this was not fair, and was not kind, and was not the beginning anyone deserves. These things are true, and they are not minimized by what came after. But what came after is the point. What came after was a woman who had been told, in every practical and material way, that she did not matter, discovering, in the compressed and unlikely schoolroom of a 2-room cottage in a Wiltshire winter, that she mattered enormously. Not because a duke had chosen her. Not because the legal restoration of her father's estate had returned to her what was rightfully hers. Not because the title of duchess had replaced the diminishment of 3 years under Cecilia's management. But because she had always mattered, and she had always known it, beneath the careful management of her own expectations, and the winter had simply given her the conditions in which to remember it fully. She had walked into that cottage frightened and humiliated and had refused, quietly, daily, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that dignity is the one thing that cannot be taken without consent, to be either of those things indefinitely. She had read her Keats and written her letters, and asked her questions, and held her ground and observed, with precision and patience, until the truth revealed itself. Not because a man saved her, but because she was the kind of person who kept looking until she found what was real. Edmund had not saved her. He had been, in the beginning, as much a complication as a comfort. Another person with a concealment, another situation requiring management, another test of the daily courage she had been practicing for 3 years. He had made her breakfast and tended the fire and faced her anger without flinching and told the truth when it cost him something. And these were not the actions of a savior, but the actions of a partner, which was something considerably more valuable. What they had built between them in that cottage, in the storm and the firelight and the shared silences and the confrontation that had cleared the air entirely, was not the breathless confection of people who had found in each other an escape from difficulty. It was the more durable thing, the understanding between two people who had both been broken by betrayal and both chosen separately and then together not to be defined by it. He had walked away from a title rather than be destroyed by the people circling it. She had endured 3 years of systematic diminishment rather than be reduced by the woman conducting it. They had arrived at the same small cottage from different directions, carrying the same essential wound. The wound of having trusted someone who used that trust as a weapon, and they had recognized each other with the particular recognition that only people who share a specific kind of knowledge can extend. And from that recognition, they had built something real. Ashenmoor in spring was a revelation that Alara had not been prepared for by its winter introduction. The formal garden bloomed in her mother-in-law's original design and exceeded it, the roses climbing the south wall with an exuberance that suggested they had been waiting for exactly this instruction. The tenant families sent letters and occasionally arrived in person, and Alara received them in the east sitting room with a directness and genuine interest that quickly made her more approachable than the great house might have suggested. Mrs. Pierce stopped being professionally warm and became simply warm, which was better. Edmund's leg improved through the spring, not dramatically, not to the point of releasing the crutch entirely, but measurably, in the way that things improve when the conditions of daily life are no longer defined by concealment and stress and the particular physical toll of pretending to be something one is not. He moved through Ashenmoor with the settled authority of a man fully occupying his own life, and he continued every day to give her the complete transparency he had promised, not as a performance of trustworthiness, but as the simple practice of a person who had decided that honesty was not an occasional virtue, but a daily one. They disagreed, sometimes. She found him too cautious. He found her occasionally too willing to engage frontal conflict where strategy would serve better. She thought his management of the northern estate accounts was overcomplicated. He thought her instinct to trust the new land agent was premature. These were real disagreements, conducted with real directness, and they were also, she found, among the most satisfying conversations of her life, the particular satisfaction of being taken seriously by someone she took equally seriously, of being argued with rather than managed. Cecilia's legal proceedings resolved in the autumn. The criminal matter was handled by the courts with a thoroughness that Aldworth described as satisfying and a discretion that Edmund had requested and received. She was not destroyed. Ilara had not wanted destruction, but she was diminished in every way that had mattered to her. The estate was gone. The social position was compromised. The resources were restricted. Whether she learned anything from it, Ilara could not say, and found, as the months passed, that she cared less and less about the answer. The space Cecilia had occupied in her daily thinking shrank as Ashmore grew, and this, she understood, was the truest form of resolution available. Not the absence of consequence for the person who wronged you, but the shrinking of their significance in the landscape of your own life. The solicitor's letter confirming full restoration of the Ashwood estate arrived on a morning in October, when the Wiltshire trees were burning with color, and the light was the particular amber of deep autumn. Ilara read it at the library desk in the east wing, and set it down, and sat quietly for a moment with her hands in her lap, and she thought about her father, about his warmth and his modest goodness, and the rose garden, and the evenings in the library, and the particular quality of being loved by someone who loved you simply, without agenda or condition. She thought, he would have liked Edmund. He would have liked, specifically, that Edmund made her breakfast. She would have the portrait moved, she decided, the one Cecilia had relegated to the dim corner near the door. She would have it moved somewhere with proper light and a proper wall, somewhere it would be seen daily by people passing through the hall of a life that had been built, against considerable resistance, into something worthy of him. She told Edmund this over supper that evening, and he listened with his full attention, and when she was finished he said simply, "Tell me where you want it and it will be done," and returned to his meal. And she thought that this quality of being heard without fanfare, of being taken at her word, of having what she said responded to, as though it naturally mattered, was perhaps the most profound change that the past year had made in her daily life. She had been treated, for 3 years, as though her preferences were inconveniences. She was treated, now, as though they were simply facts, relevant, worth noting, worth acting on. The difference was enormous. The difference was everything. On the first anniversary of the candlelit ceremony in the cold chapel, Ilara stood at the window of the master bedroom at Ashmore and looked out at the autumn garden below, and thought about the woman who had stood at that altar in November, frightened beneath the composure, humiliated beneath the dignity, holding herself together with both hands in the dark. She felt for her, that woman. She understood her completely. But she did not pity her, because that woman had done everything correctly, had kept her eyes open and her spine straight and her mind working and her heart, against all reasonable advice, accessible, and had arrived, by way of a frozen chapel and a 2-room cottage and a snowstorm and a duke in a worn coat, at exactly here. Arms came around her from behind, warm, familiar, entirely certain. Edmund rested his chin lightly at her temple and looked out at the autumn garden with her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered the question. She thought about freezing altars and winter roses, and a ring too large for her finger, and 200 honest words on a single folded page. She thought about a shelf of 20 books, and a Keats volume, and a fire kept carefully tended through the coldest nights. She thought about a man who had lowered himself to one knee on a stone floor because he believed it was owed to her, and about the laugh she had heard in the great hall that she had been hearing, in various forms, every day since. "That I am glad," she said, "of all of it, even the parts that were very hard." He was quiet for a moment, his arms steady around her, the autumn garden golden below them. "Even the cold chapel?" he asked. "Especially the cold chapel," she said. "Without it, we are two people who never met." She felt him press a kiss to her hair, brief, unhurried, entirely without performance. "Then I'm glad of it too," he said softly. Outside, the Wiltshire autumn continued its slow and flaming business, indifferent to the specifics of the lives conducted in the houses it surrounded, burning its annual and magnificent proof that things could be stripped entirely bare and still, given the right conditions and sufficient time, come back into color. Some beginnings do not look like beginnings. Some gifts arrive in the wrong wrapping. Some of the best things that will ever happen to you will announce themselves, if they announce themselves at all, in freezing chapels in November, in the company of strangers with tired eyes and worn coats, and truths they have not yet found the courage to tell. What was meant to break her, built her. And everything, every cold morning and managed humiliation and careful daily dignity and quiet refusal to be less than she was, had been, without her knowing it, without anyone intending it, the making of exactly the life she was now living. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.